Nice quote.
Oh, didn't even start. That was
Room party starter.
Dirty Dan and the boys. Dirty Dan and the boys. They sound like they're literally outside your window.
Like Optimus Prime, where are you going all the time? There's some racist banter going on here. There's some stuff that can be held against my campaign manager for sure.
Yeah, Norm for president.
Yeah.
Here we go.
No more clapping, remember, dick face?
You sit right now.
And we're back! Welcome to episode 2 of the Dual Threat Podcast. I'm your host, Sam, here with my co-host, Nor, and JB behind the glass. Week 1 is in the books, and what a crazy week it was. Let's dive right into it. It's safe to say, some of the results and player performances this week were unexpected. It's about as small a sample size as you can get, but to showcase just how unpredictable this week was, I'd like to talk about some of the highest drafted players at particular positions and the players who now occupy those positions in total fantasy points. According to fantasyfootballcalculator.com, the top 5 drafted quarterbacks in standard scoring were Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Matt Ryan, and Russell Wilson in that order. Currently, these QBs sit at 14th, 20th, 16th, 10th, and 24th, respectively, in fantasy points. The current top 5 quarterbacks in overall fantasy points: Alex Smith, Matthew Stafford, Sam Bradford, Trevor Siemian, and Derek Carr as 1 through 5.
Everyone we would expect. Just like we drew it up.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
The top 5 drafted running backs in standard scoring: David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell, LaShawn McCoy, Devonta Freeman, and Melvin Gordon. Currently, these running backs sit at 36th, 41st, 5th, 17th, and 11th in fantasy points. The current top 5 running backs in overall fantasy points are Kareem Hunt, Mike Gillislee, Leonard Fournette, Tariq Cohen, and LaShawn McCoy. 3 of the top 5 fantasy performances from a running back in week 1 were from rookies. And finally, according to fantasyfootballcalculator.com, the top 5 drafted tight ends in standard scoring: Rob Gronkowski, Travis Kelce, Greg Olsen, Jordan Reed, Jimmy Graham. Currently, these tight ends sit at 20th, 17th, 39th, 22nd, and 56th, respectively, in fantasy points. The current top 5 tight ends, you ask? Austin Hooper, Jesse James, Charles Clay, Coby Fleener, and Jason Witten. My point is, this week was a proverbial minefield of poor performances and injuries, and this is why DraftKings offers to make someone a billionaire for submitting a perfect lineup. Nor, it's impossible. It can't be done. Your thoughts?
I have no idea where I am right now based on the stats you just gave me. That is a ridiculous list of players that carried multiple people to wins this week, whereas studs were just like every girl I've ever met, left me desiring more.
Okay, well, I just wanted to get that out in the open in case you thought this was the real world we're living in. Now, let's start off with some news and notes from around the league. So we have to start with David Johnson, running back from Arizona Cardinals. The big news: he underwent wrist surgery on Tuesday and will likely be out 2 to 3 months. Arizona Sports' Mike Jurecki expects the Cardinals to use a running back by committee in the absence of David Johnson. There are rumors that Chris Johnson is going to be re-signed by the team, so the situation could get messy. And what compounds the problem is Cardinals left tackle DJ Humphries sprained his MCL and is out 2 to 3 weeks. Nor, what do we do in this situation of losing the number 1 overall fantasy pick?
It's hard to say there's one way to go about patchwork fixing a team that just lost the preeminent number 1 draft pick in pretty much every draft that went on. If the Cardinals are going to come out here and say that they're running back by committee, maybe Chris Johnson comes back in. It's almost one of those situations where even getting the handcuff or the guy that you're thinking is going to be the lead back might not even be worth adding onto your roster. That offense looked completely lost without David Johnson. Carson Palmer looked even older than he is, and I'm pretty sure he is 73 years old. With their left tackle gone as well, I'm starting to think that this entire offense might be something you want to avoid.
Agreed. Yeah, it was definitely on the shoulders of David Johnson to carry this offense, and without him and without their starting left tackle, they underperformed in week 1. It doesn't look like the future is going to get any brighter.
And additionally, David Johnson's one of those guys that you just expected to be such a workhorse. I'm almost positive no one even drafted a handcuff or anyone that you'd want to worry about just in case something happens to him or anything like that. Just an unfortunate set of circumstances right out of the gate.
Definitely agreed. I want to spend a little more time on that because obviously the high-profile nature of David Johnson's injury, but we're going to breeze through the rest of these news items here. Andrew Luck's shoulder has already been ruled out as of Tuesday against Week 2 versus the Cardinals. That can't be good news as they ruled him out very early. That hints that he might be more than a few weeks away from returning. There's already rumors that he'll be out until October. Not good for the Colts. Pete Carroll confirmed Tuesday that running back Thomas Rawls will play in Week 2. Corey must be thanking his lucky stars as he doesn't have to count on Robert Kelly and Frank Gore to carry the load. Bills offensive coordinator Rick Dennison indicated that he has no plans to back off LaShawn McCoy's workload in an effort to keep McCoy healthy. I can't decide if that's good news or bad news for Mike Ariola. We'll see if LaShawn's health can hold up. Allen Robinson, wide receiver, Jacksonville Jaguars. Robinson left the game after suffering a left knee injury on the third play of the game. It was later confirmed to be a torn ACL, and Robinson will miss the rest of the 2017 season. Nor, let me throw it to you. Do you see anybody who can fill the vacuum in Jacksonville for Allen Robinson?
Less of a committee situation, as we were talking about with David Johnson. They've got two receivers there that Blake Bortles has been able to build some chemistry with over the last few seasons. You got Marquise Lee, who's probably going to replace him as your Z receiver outside, and then Allen Hurns. He's actually had fantasy relevance in years past coming out of the slot. So I would say those two are going to be where the target share that Allen Robinson would have will be split between them. An unfortunate situation for Jacksonville in a lot of terms. Not only is Allen Robinson in a contract year, you're also trying to see what you can get out of Blake Bortles this year. Even with the offense shifting in terms of focus and scheme into more of a run-heavy with Leonard Fournette, you still obviously need your number one receiver to stretch the field, to keep teams from loading the box, all of those things. And lastly, just adding on to kind of the snake bit nature that the Jaguars are dealing with, D.D. Westbrook was a player I really liked coming out of the draft. They snagged him very late. And this could have been a great opportunity for him, but he was also placed on IR just before the season started.
Okay, moving on. Danny Woodhead, running back, Baltimore Ravens. Woodhead suffered a hamstring injury and did not return. Woodhead missed the last 2 preseason games with the hamstring injury, and if this is an aggravation, expect Woodhead to be week to week in his recovery timetable. Kevin White, wide receiver, Chicago Bears. White sustained a shoulder injury and was ruled out of the game. It was the 5th game of his career after being drafted 7th overall in 2015. On Monday, ESPN's Jeff Dickerson reported that White had a fractured scapula, and the team fears he will need season-ending surgery. White has been placed on injured reserve. Not a lot of fantasy analysis there, but you got a feel for Kevin White. 5 games in 2 years. That's tough.
I mean, for varying reasons, I feel for all these guys, right? Like, David Johnson, obviously, he had high hopes for what this year could have been, 1,000 yards receiving, 1,000 yards rushing. He was swinging for the fences. Some of the other guys you mentioned, I touched on Allen Robinson already, obviously, contract year, all of that. Just really unfortunate, considering we've seen what he can do in terms of his ceiling in the league already. Danny Woodhead, been around forever, kind of always been that overlooked guy, managed to just always have a positive impact in games and on at least 3 different teams now. A re-aggravation of his hamstring injury, I'd be surprised if we see him any sooner than maybe even a month or 2, just to not risk the hamstring becoming an issue further down the road. And then Kevin White, I mean, probably the saddest story out of all this, and that's hard to say when you got a guy like Allen Robinson being lost for the year already, but we don't even know what Kevin White could be in the NFL yet. He just hasn't had a chance to play enough to even show if whether or not he was worth the 7th overall pick in 2015.
We're going to move on to our next section here, which is our breakdown of each individual matchup, and we'll review the man of the match, the biggest disappointment, and our overall thoughts. Matchup 1 will begin with Alex Gomez versus Kevin Wallen. I don't know about you, Nor, but my man of the match, which is the best performing or most clutch performer in the matchup, is going to be Aaron Rodgers. And the mark of a franchise QB is someone who is able to elevate his team and will them to victory. This is exactly what Rodgers did here, going 28 of 42 for 311 yards and a touchdown and an interception apiece, totaling 16 fantasy points for Kevin. It was an ugly day for quarterbacks league-wide, but Rodgers did just enough against a stout Seattle defense to secure the win for the Packers and Kevin's fantasy team. The biggest disappointment from this matchup obviously has to go with Gomez's quarterback Andy Dalton here. Hurricane Irma has wide-reaching effects, and the postponed Bucs-Dolphin game forces Gomez to go with Andy Dalton against what we now know is a very stout Baltimore defense. Andy Dalton left a lot to be desired as he went 16 of 31 for 170 yards with 0 touchdowns and 4 interceptions to go along with a fumble lost. Netting Dalton a final score of -4 fantasy points. You expect a certain floor with your starting quarterback, but Dalton really let Gomez down in what turned out to be a fairly close matchup.
I think one of the more frustrating situations here was that Gomez had no choice but to start Andy Dalton, given the Hurricane situation with Jameis. So knowing that the matchup could have been an ugly one with Baltimore's stingy defense, the strength of Baltimore's defense is their run defense, and C.J. Mosley and controlling everything up front. Their corners have been susceptible at times to be beat, so you would have at least thought that Dalton might have a pretty safe floor. -4, there's nothing safe about that. You just got to feel bad for that type of situation.
Yep. My overall thoughts on this matchup was it's a big disappointment factor here in the championship game rematch. The rosters weren't too spectacular going into this contest, but you expected a few tricks up these owners' sleeves, but it appears their rosters performed at face value, and with the injuries to Allen Robinson and David Johnson, Gomez and Kevin's outlooks aren't looking much better.
I think this was just a situation of a perfect storm of negative elements come into play here. Storm, pun intended. But both Kevin and Gomez are going to have to deal with not just what's left of their teams as of right now, but rebuilding them from the ground up in terms of getting more talent back on their rosters.
All right, let's move on to matchup number 2. We have Mike Arriola versus Tony Funston. Now, my man of the match is going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers defense and special teams. The Steelers throttled the youthful Browns, compiling 7 sacks, an interception, a blocked punt, and a touchdown while only allowing 18 total points. The Steelers D put up an impressive 20 fantasy point performance and really sealed the win for Tony this week. My biggest disappointment, Christian McCaffrey. Not a terrible stat line with 85 total yards, but McCaffrey had a late game fumble and was benched for the remainder of the game, leaving him to finish with a total of 5 fantasy points. Now, the game was out of hand, but Jonathan Stewart definitely was in there to finish the game. I don't think this will affect his playing time, but it isn't a good precedent to set if it becomes a more common issue moving forward.
I think that's the key point. Given the situation or the score in the game when the fumble happened, totally no-brainer coaching decision. Yank him from the game. Let that be a learning lesson for him that if he puts the ball on the ground, he's going to be put on the bench. And they've got a capable, trustworthy backup, or I mean, they're co-starters at this point, it seems, with Jonathan Stewart, and he just came in and carried the load the rest of the game. So for McCaffrey, that's what you got to wonder about going forward: is how short is his leash in terms of getting yanked from the game. And it's hard to pick a disappointment when you're on the winning side, but I had a close vote for DeMarco Murray as a disappointment here. Granted, like I said, Tony was able to pull out the W, but he pulled a trade to get Murray on his team this year. Obviously sees a lot of upside with him. For him to net only 5 points, a big disappointment.
Well, it stinks.
Okay, overall thoughts for the matchup. I think Tony's team performed well as expected, even without Odell Beckham Jr., and I think he's a strong contender to make the playoffs and maybe even secure the number 1 overall seed again. On the flip side, it's hard to judge Mike's team as he made a hefty investment in Mike Evans, and for him not to be available Sunday, I think that really skews the output of Mike's team. All right, matchup number 3. We're going with my cohort here, Noor versus Corey. Man of the match, in my opinion. Obviously, yours might differ, but many players perform well on Noor's team, but the obvious choice here is Kareem the Dream Hunt, setting an NFL record for total yardage in an NFL debut with 148 yards and a touchdown on the ground, along with 98 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. It was an impressive showing, and Hunt really took advantage of the injury-ravaged Patriots defense, finishing the game with 39 total fantasy points. Noor, I need to get your reaction. You could not have been expecting this from Hunt.
I certainly wasn't expecting it given how the game started out. His first carry, it was a nice play design. He ran off tackle and was on his way to picking up 8 yards. And I'm like, oh, great, they're featuring him already. Like, let's get him the ball. Awesome. Oh, look, is that the ball on the ground? Oh, cool, he fumbled it. That's awesome. First carry in his career is fumble. Quickly look up on my laptop how many career fumbles he had in college. None. He had not lost a fumble in college. So I'm like, oh, this is just because I drafted him and he's on my team. This is why he's fumbling right now. And if I closed my eyes and listened carefully enough, I could hear bells ringing as people expected me to serve them more beer. But as it turns out, that was just the beginning of his night, and an amazing response from him in terms of bouncing back from that. I doubt he'll put up 39 points every week. If he wants to, I'll be perfectly fine with it. But for him to have the game that he had, given the start, pretty amazing.
Let me ask you something, Nort. Did we ruin Christmas for you? Because whenever you hear Jingle Bells, do you just get Vietnam flashbacks?
Actually, just when people talk about Le'Veon Bell, I break into a sweat.
Hey, so do I. So do I.
For very different reasons.
It's more of a fever dream than anything. Biggest disappointment for this matchup? It would be easy to go with Rob Gronkowski here as the All-Pro tight end finish with just 33 receiving yards, but I wouldn't call that disappointing necessarily, as he was deadlocked in a one-on-one matchup with the Pro Bowl safety Eric Berry for most of the day, and most teams don't have an Eric Berry to put in Gronk's back pocket, so better days to come. Instead, I'm going to go with DeAndre Hopkins in this spot. The stat line for Hopkins may indicate he had an average game with 55 yards and a touchdown, but it is disappointing because the production was on 16 targets in a game the Texans trailed by a large margin. In other words, a very favorable game script for Hopkins to produce. He even had a half of both Savage and Watson. In this scenario, Hopkins still managed to pull in less than half of his targets for only 55 total yards. It remains to be seen if he can be more efficient with Watson under center, but it seems like Hopkins needs an insane amount of volume to be an above-average fantasy wideout.
I agree with the choices here. I think with Hopkins, it might have been more of a situation of game flow. The Jaguars were just eating the Houston offensive line alive. Calais Campbell had 3.5 sacks in the first half. I don't think Savage was getting nearly enough time to even really get the ball to Hopkins. 16 targets is definitely more what you want to see, but I don't know how many of those passes actually got to him. Most of his work was done when Watson came in the game, and I think that's not too surprising. If you look at the build of a DeAndre Hopkins, kind of similar to Mike Williams, the rookie that the Chargers went with at Clemson. Deshaun Watson and Mike Williams, that was his safety net. That was a security blanket. So I think he knows how to give a 50-50 shot to a big play receiver like DeAndre Hopkins. In terms of Gronk, I think that's also a fair choice. But as you mentioned, Eric Berry had a lot to do with that. Also, Tom Brady had an off game, missed some throws. It was just one of those weird circumstances, the perfect storm kind of situations. And quick shout out to the list of players that got hurt this weekend. Eric Berry is one of the more fun players to watch in the league, and having him not around for the rest of the year, bit of a bummer.
Yeah, definitely a dark cloud over that Kansas City win over the New England Patriots. So my overall thoughts for this matchup, Nor's team, your team was impressive. Despite the subpar performance from Kirk Cousins, you got to be expecting more of an output than that. But if Kareem Hunt can perform like an RB1 for the rest of the season, maybe not 39 points, but an RB1 nonetheless, you sport an impressive running back core with Gurley, Fournette, Hunt. It's an impressive one-year turnaround. I got to give it to you, Nor, and it's amazing what you can do when you're out of the shadow of Trent Richardson.
And what a large shadow it was.
A large, bulging, waddling shadow.
A large shadow running into the back of his own lineman. I think in terms of getting lucky with how Cousins' performance was, it's going to take some time for him to get comfortable with the other pieces in that offense, mainly Terrell Pryor. Also, Philly's front seven was just getting after him all day. I'm not surprised he had as off of a game as he did. So hopefully I don't have to rely on a 39-point outing to sneak by.
All right, we'll move on to matchup number 4. This is going to be myself, Sam, versus JB behind the glass. The man of the match is, I'll say it again, it was a disappointing week for quarterback fantasy output, but Marcus Mariota was solid in his outing at home against the Oakland Raiders, finishing with 256 passing yards and 26 yards on the ground, along with a rushing touchdown. Mariota finished with 18 fantasy points, which proved to be the difference. My biggest disappointment from this matchup has got to be the Texans' defense and special teams. Seems like an ideal matchup at home against the Jaguars, but the Texans' defense got pounded, compiling no turnovers, no sacks, or defensive scores, and allowed 29 total points to the Jags' offense. It was a pathetic showing that netted -2 fantasy points. It's hard to envision starting them moving forward, especially at the Bengals, at the Patriots, and at home versus the Titans and Chiefs the next 4 weeks, but my salary cap may force this undesirable move.
Yeah, you definitely don't like those particular matchups coming up, but if I had them on my roster, I would have started them this weekend as well. You got to think that I was expecting there to be more of an emotional boost from everything that's going on in Houston and everything that J.J. Watt's done over the last few weeks. This could have been one of those games where you just see him take over and do it for all the right reasons. Those upcoming matchups, I don't know. You might have to see what else is out there.
So overall thoughts on this matchup, lots of disappointing performances in this matchup. Le'Veon Bell, Devonta Freeman, Alshon Jeffrey, Michael Thomas, Jordan Reed, Devontae Adams, Kelvin Benjamin, all put up fewer than 50 total yards. So lots of room for improvement here on both sides, but Jason gets out with the victory and starts 1-0. For the fifth and final matchup, we have Alex Slater versus Mike Ferralis. Now, my man of the match, unconventional choice here, but I'm going with Dan Bailey. Dan Bailey was an important asset in this match as he sunk 4 field goals of 21, 36, 42, and 48 yards to go along with an extra point. The Cowboys had trouble finishing a lot of drives, but Ferralis benefited with long field goals from Dan Bailey, resulting in 15 fantasy points.
I mean, you never know when you're going to get struck with a ugly scoring week like this, and so any points that you can get are going to be important. Kickers are people too.
The biggest fantasy disappointment from this matchup for me was Lamar Miller. He finished with 9 fantasy points, but the issue is it looked exactly like 2016 Lamar Miller. Low efficiency, low ceiling, low touchdown potential. It has to be a little scary for Ferralis, but maybe the Jags defense is better than we give him credit for. Let's see if Lamar Miller's efficiency can improve with Deshaun Watson under center.
And I think that's the important thing to note here is the boost that potentially could come with Deshaun Watson being there instead of Tom Savage. Other elements of the offense get added in terms of being able to move him out of the pocket. You can set up more screens that way, things like that. And even elements like the zone read that you can't use with Tom Savage might be able to help Lamar Miller.
Agreed. So overall thoughts for this final matchup here, just like Areola, Slater was affected by the postponement of the Bucs-Dolphins game and the absence of Jay Ajayi. It hurts that Kenny Golladay was on the bench during his 2-touchdown performance, but the good news moving forward is at the worst, Slater has found a boom-bust wide receiver 2 in the rookie from Northern Illinois. For Ferralis, Amari Cooper was solid and received 13 targets to Michael Crabtree's 7. If that type of ratio keeps up, expect big things from Cooper moving forward.
Quick hit on both these receivers, starting with Amari Cooper. I think the upside for what we saw out of him was that the Raiders were actually targeting him and featuring him inside the red zone. I think last year he had something like 7 total targets all year inside the red zone, clearly dominated by Michael Crabtree being more featured down there. So they, whether it was matchup-based or just something they're putting an onus on in Oakland this year, they were trying to get him the ball a lot. And the first touchdown he scored, that was a big boy touchdown. He caught it inside the 5, put his shoulder down, took a couple people with him and broke the plane. The next drive was a little bit peculiar, though, as he was targeted on 3 straight throws while Marshawn Lynch was wondering what was going on in the sideline and how his Seattle jersey had now become black. It's the same treatment we saw in the end of the Super Bowl, and got to wonder if that's the case going forward. And in terms of Kenny Golladay, props to Slater for taking a shot on the receiver that was making a lot of noise in preseason. You have players like that every preseason, I feel like, that just they seem to be going off. You're not sure if they're for real or if it's just a matter of who they're playing against. But not only did Golladay ball out, but he was utilized with 6 catches, 70 yards, 2 touchdowns. It looks like he's a direct benefactor of the targets that Anquan Boldin was receiving last year. It'll be interesting to see down the road if he's just utilized in the red zone or are they actually going to use him as their slot receiver and he gets to join the receptions party that Matt Stafford likes to throw. Props to Slater again for taking a shot on Golladay. He can book himself a suite at the Golladay Inn.
Yeah, it's nice to see those players in preseason with that consistent drum beat make it all the way to the regular season and perform in their rookie outing or whatever year they are in the NFL. And it's nice to see Slater take a risk on those type of players, and the drumbeat continues into the regular season. So now we're going to move on to our best and worst starts of the week. This is different than our man of the match because we're going to take into account a lot of different factors, including the chutzpah that it took to start this player and the variables come along with starting this player. So my best start of the week, again, I feel like I'm getting sick saying his name too much, but you can't deny his impact on week 1 and the fantasy landscape for the rest of the season. It's Kareem Hunt.
I'm the best.
I can't say enough about this performance. It's not just how successful Hunt's performance was, but for Noor to start the unproven rookie on the road against a defense that was top 5 in scoring last season. Sorry, Jason. It took guts, and it paid off in spades. 39 fantasy points. Really impressed by Hunt's quickness, burst, ability to catch the ball, and his mental toughness to come back from that opening drive fumble. I don't think this is a fluke. I think he's got the skills, and he's got the mental toughness to be an RB1 the rest of the season in Andy Reid's offense. Moving on to our worst start of the week.
You're a fucking idiot.
Jamison Crowder. Now, hindsight's 20/20, but this start really cost Areola as Jamison Crowder got the start in the flex position as Mike Gillislee and his 22 fantasy points rode the bench. I think Crowder's role in this offense with an active Jordan Reed, Josh Doxson, and a newly acquired Terrell Pryor was unclear, and it may have proven beneficial for Mike to wait a week or two to see how it fleshed out. For Gillislee, at the very worst, it could have been assumed he was the goal line back. And in offense as potent as the Patriots, I would have liked to take the shot on the touchdown potential.
I think this is the type of decision that's it's gonna present itself down the road for Mike. He's got receivers that he can start. He's got decisions to make at his flex almost weekly about whether or not it's going to be Gillislee, is it going to be McCaffrey, what's he going to do here. So it's one of those things, and we touched on it during the inaugural episode. The Patriots' backfield, extremely difficult to figure out. Just when you think you got them figured out, you realize you have no idea.
Okay, moving on to our matchup preview. Nora, what is a matchup that you're looking forward to next week?
The matchup I'm looking forward to this week is, as luck would have it, Sam versus Mike Ferralis. Team Bend Danny versus Getting Off Zeke Clean. It'll be interesting to see if Ferralis goes with the trustworthy stack of Phillip Rivers and Keenan Allen against the Dolphins defense. I'm not really sure what to expect the Dolphins defense. If Vontae Davis is going to play or not is totally up in the air. Don't have any idea what kind of pass rush they're going to have. I think this could be one where both Rivers and Keenan Allen end up cleaning up. Also, it'll be interesting to see if he goes with a 3 running back setup and sticking with 2 wide receivers. After what we saw out of Amari Cooper week 1, given the amount of targets he was given in the red zone, yes, there were some drops, but if he can turn any of those targets into touchdowns, you're talking about the kind of leap that goes from a wide receiver 2 to a wide receiver 1. And if Amari Cooper can see the volume of targets that he saw last week and be able to convert more than just one of them, you're looking at the type of output that will push him from a wide receiver 2 into a wide receiver 1.
Okay, the matchup that I'm really looking forward to is Gomez versus Funston. I'm really looking forward to this matchup as the team name smack talk has already commenced. Gomez woefully underperformed last week, but the last thing you want to do is provoke the karma gods by kicking a man when he's down. Hopefully, this doesn't blow up in Tony's face.
Leave it to Tony to go with not only a team name that only hopes to inspire rage from his opponent, but also just one of the worst team names I've probably ever heard. Tony's team name being 30 points all day. Your forte?
You don't like it. I think it was pretty creative. Gomez, also funny, but more vulgar. I think the callback for Tony, I think it works. I think it plays.
And Gomez, in eloquence only we could love, chokes on Cox like he chokes in the playoffs.
Of course. Fucking Fergus.
So those are the matchups we're looking forward to. Let's move on to some tough start-sit decisions for next week's matchups. Okay, Nor, this will be our weekly section with tough start-sit decisions. Why don't you give me some fringe players that may not have performed well last week or weren't on people's radars that you would start this week?
So the first one would have to be Martavis Bryant versus the Vikings. Obviously, a disappointing week in terms of just putting out 1 point, but you got to assume that Xavier Rhodes and a majority of the defense is going to be preoccupied with Antonio Brown, Le'Veon Bell, and trying to get after Ben Roethlisberger. I see Martavis Bryant getting a couple of those patented screens that he ends up stretching and maybe even taking the distance. But also, in the situation that Kevin's in, you've got to start your home run hitters, and he's got no choice, really. Right after that, Dez Bryant versus Denver. Obviously, it's always a questionable situation when you've got a number one target going against the Denver no-fly zone defense. But Dez was targeted early and often in the game on Sunday, and even with the likes of Aqib Talib draped all over him, you got to like the fact that he's going to get the ball in the red zone. He's going to get it between the 20s, and you'd like to think that Dak will be able to bounce back from the couple of errant throws that he had in week one. Next, we got Mike Gillislee at the Saints. You got to think that the Patriots are going to be out for blood after the week one embarrassment. And as you mentioned earlier, Gillislee is at least being featured as the red zone back, if nothing else. I think he ended up with 5 carries, 40 yards, and 3 touchdowns. So that's purely goal line work. I would give him the nod against the Saints defense that, despite their best effort, is still the Saints defense. Lastly, my star, a player that underperformed that I would recommend starting, Kelvin Benjamin versus the Bills. Benjamin was not targeted nearly as much as we thought. Part of this was clearly attributed to game flow, not really needing to target him a bunch. The Panthers were spotted a bunch of points in short field and turnovers. And you could see that Cam Newton's shoulder was clearly not right still. He missed on a couple of throws where people were open. I think Kelvin gets fed a little bit more early against the Bills defense that I don't even know if you or I are starting at corner for them right now.
Yeah, the Jets put up points on the Bills, so I think Kelvin Benjamin is a safe pick there. How about someone that got the start last week that may need to sit down?
First off the list, I'd have to say Bilal Powell. Bilal Powell at Oakland Raiders. I do think he's going to potentially get a volume of touches here, but game flow, I'd expect this one to quickly get out of hand, given who the Jets are and who the Raiders are at this moment. Right after that, I would say Rob Kelly at the Rams. This has a little bit more to do with the matchup itself and not just game flow. The Rams defense looked every bit the part of a Wade Phillips defense last week. They went off. They were aggressive. As soon as they got their hands on the ball, they were trying to go the other way with it versus the Redskins offense, which just looked out of sync last week and out of sorts. And if the front seven of the Eagles was bothering you, I'm assuming that the front seven and aggressive corners of the Rams will also bother you. So Rob Kelly will probably be running into a wall all day.
Let's not forget that Aaron Donald ended his holdout, and he will be starting and playing in week 2 as well.
Amazing point. You never trust a man with 2 first names, but Aaron Donald will rip you in half like a phone book.
Well, Robert Kelly has also something to say about that.
Blah. Blah. Last sit of the week, sit recommendation you can call it. Tyler Eifert versus the Houston defense. We touched on it earlier in terms of how much of a disappointment Houston's defense was in their matchup last week, but even more disappointing than possibly anyone in fantasy football was Andy Dalton's performance with the solid -4 showing that you mentioned earlier. Given how off balance and shaky he looked, it's really hard to trust any of his targets. Eifert being the piece of their offense that is most dependent on touchdowns, I just don't see the upside.
So there you have Nora's start and sit recommendations. We'll move on to our final segment here, which of course is the much anticipated first issuance of the weekly power rankings. We'll start off at number 10. Number 10 goes to Alex Gomez. Now, not as bad as his 30 overall point performance would indicate, but with the loss of Allen Robinson and not a lot of high-ceiling players on this roster, he's holding serve at 10. Number 9, Kevin Wallen. It would be higher if not for the devastating injury to consensus number 1 overall pick, David Johnson. Number 8, Corey Hart. Overall talent is average, really relying on Rawls and Martin to carry his running back court. Number 7, Sam Nix. Surface level talent, but definitely saw some cracks in the armor. Number 6, JB behind the glass. A good mixture of safe players and high ceilings. Number 5, Michael Areola. Lots of boom-bust potential with this truncated roster, but I would hate to face him during a boom week as he's almost unbeatable upside. Number 4, Ferralis. Not star-studded, but very solid lineup from top to bottom. Number 3, Alex Slater. Still a believer in his starting lineup. It's his depth that worries me. Number 4, Noor Sandhu, led by your running backs Fournette, Gurley, and now Hunt. Seems like a formidable trio. Question mark?
Peaches and Kareem?
And at the number 1 spot, of course, Tony Funston. Overall talent and depth is undeniable. He put up 99 points in a bad overall week and was without Odell Beckham Jr. Noor, what are your thoughts on this overall first week power rankings?
Understandably, the bottom 3, there was no avoiding it. The matchup that Gomez and Kevin had, you knew that they were gonna unfortunately end up near the bottom. With Corey, it's just kind of the same old song and dance. All of his key players have to ball out every week in order for him to have a shot. And with Jason at number 6, I feel like Jason could land at 6 or 5 or maybe even 4, given the blend of players that he has. The ability to win in an ugly, low-scoring week is good for any team. It'll be interesting to see how Jason holds up in a high-scoring shootout type of affair. Speaking of shootout, we got both the mics after this. I agree with your points on Mike Areola. On a good week, he could easily lead the league in scoring. On a bad week, you just never know what's going to end up happening. Being that he's so heavily invested in the three players that he is, he's hinging on them every week. Ferralis, I feel like I honestly sometimes have no idea what Ferralis is up to, but he manages to just put these teams together that consistently hang, and week in, week out, they just seem to play up or down to their level of competition. Slater's going to slate. As much as I'm enjoying hearing you and everyone else talk about the 3 running backs that I have, I think Slater is in a great position, given the Zeke news, to be able to roll out any week with Zeke, Ajayi, and Carlos Hyde and decide which of them wants to be his flex or whatever the other variability out there, given his strength at wide receiver as well. Just a very strong team. Me, I'll skip over just because my team is and will forever be tied to the week that Kareem Hunt had. # Peaches and Cream. And Tony, it's really impressive that Tony was able to reach 99 points without ODB coming out there. This seems like that perfect Tony team that will be the 1 seed, maybe even lead the league in points, get to the playoffs, have a bye, and immediately lose.
Let's not count Tony out just yet. Let me pose a question to you, and I know we ranked him 1, and I hate to keep harping on how good Tony's team is because it kills me a little bit inside each time I say it, but have you ever seen a trio of receivers as good as Tony's? Antonio Brown, Jordy Nelson, and a healthy, hopefully sometime soon, Odell Beckham. Those players are all top 12 overall players, and they're all at his wide receiver position. His amount of depth is disgusting. Is Tony 1 top 5 tight end away from having possibly the best team we've seen in the Gridiron Gala?
Yeah, I think in terms of starting lineup, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not like he has some flyer player at quarterback either. He's got Drew Brees, always finishing near the top in terms of quarterback points. And then even if Jordan Howard is getting touches and opportunities taken away or sharing them with Tariq Cohen now, he's still got a very safe floor. Their O-line clearly is better than maybe even a lot of people thought. And then DeMarco Murray, volume is going to be there for him. So realistically, he's just got to get safe output from guys that are as capable as Brees, Jordan Howard, DeMarco Murray, and then his receivers are going to carry the load for him. Yeah, if he had a game-breaking tight end, that would make his lineup borderline perfect, but he might not even need one.
Well, we'll see how it goes. I expect a lot of shuffling in this league, as usually the standings get pretty tight throughout the season, and typically 1 or 2 games separates the winners from the losers in terms of making the playoffs and winning the championship. We'll see how that turns out. So there you have it. We have our second podcast in the books. The Dual Threat Podcast will be back next week. Same bat time, same bat network. Nor, do you got any last words for the fans?
Kareem Hunt.
JB behind the glass, you got anything? Sounds of silence. All right, we'll see you guys next week. Best of luck to your fantasy lineups. And we're out.
Bye-bye.
Rumbling, bumbling, stumbling to fumble. Rumbling, That's a Three Stooges classic.